Today we're looking at 10 different tips to make your lighting feel a lot more cinematic. So, lighting is something that we've discussed a bunch on this channel. We've looked at different types of color gels, different types of breakdowns, whether that's in movies or in some of the projects that I've made. And we've also looked at different scenarios in a live workshop with Aperture that was such an amazing experience, and we had talented guest speakers such as Kevin Terrell and Gavin Ash. So it was so great to come together and really showcase a lot of techniques, so much good nuggets of information, but I've also managed to kind of include some of the highlights in some of these tips. So without further ado, let's jump into this and let's take a look at a few simple things that you can do and keep in mind with your lighting when you're on set and when you're lighting your subject or lighting your space that can really elevate your visuals and give you that nice high budget look. So tip number one is know what you are shooting. Saying cinematic lighting is something so vague, of course. When I say it, I only mean something that looks good, something that is meant for narrative documentary, for something that could be released in a cinema. So how do we get to that type of quality? Well, the first step is to figure out what your story and what the emotion within it is and how you're going to extrapolate that and express that visually with your lighting. So that's the very first step that you really need to conquer. You really have to get in that script, break down character motivations, the type of environment that they're in, what's happening next, foreshadowing. All of these different things can be incorporated in your lighting, and when that matches the story, it alone can really boost and enhance the feel of your movie and make it look high budget, because in high budget movies they have entire departments dedicated to every little detail. Also, what you're shooting, whether it's a comedy or a drama, of course, really affects the type of lighting that you're going to be having and the type of quality of lighting that you're going to be lighting the subjects with. So that is my first tip. Really understand the script. That is your manuscript. That is where everything comes from. So all of the information that is there, it is your job when it comes to, if you're being the DP for your project or whatever other role that has to do with lighting, you want to make sure that you're bringing those themes and that story out visually with your lights. Now, tip number two is know where you're shooting. This is very important because sometimes you can go to a location that has great natural light or some really great practicals, and you can take that and use that to your advantage and then maybe highlight certain practicals or maybe enhance certain daylight that's coming in through a window or place subjects and think about blocking in a strategic way that you can maximize what's already on location so that then you don't have to, use a bunch of lights. You already have a solid base, and then you can bring out those details and add some kickers and really introduce a lot of the artistic choices once you have a really good understanding of your space and once you've fully maximized what is available to you that way. So that's the number one thing that I like to do. I like to get plenty of references of what my location looks like, of what my location also feels like, and that also dictates how you want to bring out the character of where you're shooting. If it's a grungy environment, maybe you want to look into some harsh sources and bring out some of the texture in the walls. It can really help you get inspired and come up with different creative ideas if you really have a solid understanding of where you're shooting. Now, speaking of which, tip number three is also know your limitations. So if you're shooting in a remote location, if you have to travel to it, you have to keep in mind that as an independent filmmaker, maybe if you're shooting yourself, a lot of times when I was traveling, I was carrying all the gear myself. I had loaded myself with Pelican cases and backpacks and different bags, and always trying to juggle with the weight limit with airlines. Well, that is a limitation that you have to take into account. Do you have the luxury of having your full lighting package, or can you only bring one or two lights? These are things that you need to know beforehand, and if you're doing a hired project for someone else, you need to have a clear understanding of your budget, if they're going to be able to rent gear, or if you can rent gear, or if you have to use your own equipment, and also what equipment are you using? Are you comfortable with the equipment that's being used on the shoot? Do you have a clear idea on how you can bring out the emotion or the type of quality of light with a specific tool. And then finally, speaking of limitations, know your own limitations, know where your skill set is and how much you know and how much you're comfortable with lighting. Don't put yourself in situations where you could potentially burn bridges and you are just experimenting when you're really not fully comfortable with a certain light or the way it behaves. And this happened to me on a past shoot that I organized. I had a DP that had no idea what he was doing. He kind of signed off to it because he got excited, but he bit more than what he can chew, and he was not honest with myself or with himself, and he cost the shoot. He really completely sabotaged my personal investment in it, and it was a disaster. So don't be that guy. Know your limitations, and if you feel not comfortable in certain areas or in certain type of lighting scenarios, practice. Just keep going until you feel comfortable, and don't take on jobs, especially paid jobs or jobs where you could be putting your name out in the industry where you are not fully comfortable with what you're doing. And this leads me to tip number 4. Now, a lot of times you want to just light with a bunch of lights and you just want to go overboard because you're trying to make it look so fancy and you're trying to get all these light pops and all these hair lights and kickers and on every single thing. Well, sometimes that might be a little bit too much. Sometimes less is more. One good example of this, and something that I personally love to do a lot, is using one source of light. Having one strong key can create some really nice, dramatic looking images. And a lot of times that kind of gets your creative juices flowing, and it starts to make you think a little bit more outside the box because you are so limited and you're trying to make something look good with just one source. A good example of this was in the first episode of our lighting workshop that we did with Aperture. I was lighting a dramatic night scene with one light. And with one light, you can also redirect that and bounce that back. You can use a bounce board, you can use walls, you can use whatever can reflect that light back to create some fill. And essentially fill is whatever can contrast your key to fill in some of those shadows or bring up some of those darker areas that are being caused by your main key. And this leads me to tip number 4. Really embrace and look into downstage lighting. This is something that is really powerful. It goes by different names. I call it downstage lighting. That's how I learned about it. And actually, the Film Look made a very, very good video on this. So I really recommend you guys check that video out, and also check out that channel because those guys are really doing a lot of good stuff on there and spreading a lot of good knowledge. And they look at different setups of how you can use downstage lighting, which is essentially when you are putting your key away from camera. So essentially the shadowy part of your subject is facing the camera. And I think that this looks cinematic just because it adds a lot of mystery. It makes your audience want to pry and look a little bit more at the image because there's less information. It brings out more the attention of the viewer, and it focuses more on what's going on in your scene. And also this creates a lot of contrast, it creates a lot of dimension, and it just looks really, really good. Now, another way to get a really dramatic look sometimes is to take away fill. So if you're getting a little bit too much bounce, or there's a wall that's kind of indirectly lighting the other side of your subject's face that you would want to be dark, you can introduce something called negative fill. You can do this with anything that is essentially black. You can use black curtains, you can use the bounce board and in its case, you can use essentially any surface that would absorb the light and not bounce it back. And this can really be helpful when you're trying to contain your light and not have it spill all over. And that's why flags are very useful to have on set. Have a C-stand, have a few flags. It is a little bit of an expense, but it is so worth it. And honestly, it is so important to be able to contain your light and really make sure that you are not losing control over where it's bouncing in your scene. Now, another way of containing light and really getting a handle over that is by light placement. The way you place lights can really affect your scene, of course. And for example, with the light that I'm using right now as this side kicker that you're seeing, the placement of that was very tricky. You can see there's a little bit of a flare. I kind of dig that. I kind of wanted to leave that in. It adds a little bit of color to the background. But of course, if you placed it a little bit too further in, because I'm using a wide lens, it tends to flare up a lot. So these are things you have to keep in mind. Also, how much of that light is spilling onto the background. I had it facing a little bit more towards this wall, but it was getting a little bit too much brightness behind me and I wasn't really digging it. So that's another thing that you have to keep in mind is light placement. And of course, this becomes a lot more significant when you are playing around with your key light. A lot of times what works well is placing your key at a 45-degree angle or more from camera, and that can start to create some really dramatic looks onto your subject. The closer you bring it to camera, of course, the more fill you get, the more of an even and flat look you will get with your lighting, which is great for comedies and that sort of thing. So again, the light placement, how far away from the camera, and also the height really affects how your subject is going to look. And you have to really be careful for that, because a lot of times you'll place your light in your scene and you think you're done, but the height really dramatically affects how your subject is perceived to your viewer. One thing that I mentioned in the past video was the lighting in The Godfather. Having a really extreme top-down light caused a lot of eye shadows, and it almost made the character's eyes fall into complete darkness, which again for the story was crucial because we wanted to kind of dehumanize these violent mobsters. We wanted to take that connection that we have with people's eyes away, so that it made those scenes feel a lot more tense and a lot more unpredictable. Then of course, if you go the opposite way and you go a little bit too down, then it starts to get creepy. It starts to get almost like that Camp Story flashlight vibe, where you're being very underlit, and that's unusual lighting, so that can be used and can be very effective for unusual situations, like moments in horror. So light placement can be really great for bringing out not just the themes, but also maybe some metaphors in your scene. So let's take this scene for example. Now we're seeing a lot of the things that we talked about already, so I'm making good use of the practicals, having these top-down fluorescent tubes, bringing out some of the chrome elements and the details in the cars while keeping it really moody was really nice. And then when we get to the close-up, I introduced a small LED panel to the side of my subject. And this kind of gave this split look where half of the face falls into shadow and the other half is illuminated by our warm panel. And this was to show the duality of this moment, because the character has both very positive childhood memories with this vehicle, since it was always his dream car, but he also holds a lot of regrets over actions that he did towards his father when he took this car without his permission and crashed it. So there's kind of this bittersweet and nostalgia that's going on in this scene, and I really want to bring out that emotionally with the lighting to show that it's not all perfect and that this car really does bring mixed emotions to our subject. And this is all without getting into colors, which is something that you definitely should keep in mind when it comes to your lighting. And that is probably one of the easiest ways to bring out certain character motifs or certain character attributes and even character arcs, or just creating separation. Lighting and color can be used in so many different ways and is a language on its own. And I've actually done a full video on color theory, on color when it comes to lighting specifically. So I really recommend you guys watch those videos, because color can be really, really powerful. Now, moving on from light placement, another really key factor in choosing how you're lighting your scene is the size of your light. So that is particularly important when it comes to human faces and subjects. The bigger your light source, the more of a pleasing and softer and almost beauty lighting you get out of your subject. So a lot of times you see a lot of YouTubers, including myself, use the aperture 120D or the 300D, and they have these really big soft boxes or these domes, and that essentially allows to spread out that light and soften it to a much larger source rather than having, you know, a panel or a single source LED. It just really brings it out and opens it, and it really wraps around the face very nicely, and it's very pleasing to look at. And again, this is a very nice and clean lighting that would work well for a lot of different applications, like interviews or even a afternoon look or sort of an indoor vibe. There's a lot that you can do even with just placing your subject in a certain way facing a window. You can get sort of that same type of wraparound of that soft light, especially on a cloudy day. Now, we've talked about controlling light with flags and other things like that, but you can also control your light in some pretty unusual ways, not just by moving your light away from certain directions, but you can also modify that light source itself with maybe some barn doors, or if you don't have any barn doors, what I really recommend having on set is some black wrap, which is essentially kind of like tinfoil. It's really stiff and you can kind of mold it around certain lights. And I've used this a lot on sets to black out some practicals. Like you see in this shot, for example, I wanted to only have one of these top lights shine down and have the rest of them off. Of course, in a house, you don't have the luxury of being able to turn every single light bulb on and off. A lot of times they're kind of wired to that same circuit. So this is something that is very handy. Black wrap, I really recommend having it on set. And of course you can get creative, just like Kevin showed in the lighting workshop. He used a soda can and he actually cut a portion of it and he was able to place that over light bulbs in our scene. So whatever practicals that he didn't want to kind of shine in a certain direction, he used that can and rotated it in a way where it would block out some of the light from, for example, hitting the back wall. Now, something else that kind of ties in with light placement and bouncing and creating fill is ambient lighting. This is something that a lot of times you can overlook, especially when your location has a lot of natural light spilling in. But something that is very effective is shining a light, for example, at a ceiling or at a wall, most times a ceiling, and really shine a lot of ambient light down into your shot. And you can really create some different moods and also create some very effective separation by using different color gels and creating some color contrast and some complementary colors when you are using maybe a warmer key light compared to a more cooler and bluish background light and ambient light. So one way that I've done this, for example, my latest short film, Once in a Lifetime, was by shooting a 120D up to the ceiling. It was just an open face and I added this kind of like sickly green gel, which made the ambience of these grungy environments feel even dirtier and even more sad. And then of course you can bring that idea even further by introducing some kickers of that same color and you can get really creative, but that can be very, very effective for mood and also just to bring your overall ambience level up, especially in some high contrast and some really dark environments. It's always handy to just introduce a little tiny bit of ambience in your shadows so that you are getting a lot less noise, especially if you're using a DSLR body. And then of course, you can always crunch that back down in post, or you can crush those shadows a little bit more to your liking, but then you have that information there and you can have more control when you're editing and when you're color grading. Another thing when it comes to ambience is the secret to instantly getting a cinematic vibe in your scene is haze. Haze your scenes. It doesn't matter if there isn't a fire in your scene or there isn't any motivation for smoke or haze. Put in a little tiny bit of layer of haze, because what ends up happening is it not only creates a sense of depth, but all of those tiny haze particles from your haze machine are interacting with your lights. So it diffuses the light even more and it creates a much more amalgamated look, and it allows it to spread in your scene in a much more natural way, and it just feels and looks instantly cinematic. Every movie does this, and a lot of times logistically you can't because of smoke alarms or things like that. This is something that can honestly take your lighting from a 70 to 100%, because it's that extra little bit of touch that is very significant once you see that it's there. Of course, be safe when doing this. Don't just show up to any location and start spraying haze and smoke everywhere. A lot of locations, you can't do that. I've shot in medical facilities, I've shot in music studios, and you have to be really careful with the type of haze that you're using, if it's water-based or if it could damage any instruments or anything that is there on location. So definitely keep that in mind, but if you can, use haze. Don't go crazy, don't go overboard with it, but it can be a really powerful tool to really bring all your lighting together and again, get that really nice cinematic look. All right, and my final tip is just to be creative. As cliche as that sounds, these are all things that have worked for me just by honestly experimenting. A lot of the discoveries that you can make with lighting is by putting down the textbooks and all these ideas and just moving your lights around. So don't be afraid to practice with your friends. You know, you don't have to be shooting a movie or be hired on a project to play with lights. You can use whatever LED light you have on hand, whatever practicals, even a single bulb, and you can play with that and really get familiar with one source, two sources, maybe three, and how they all interact together. And you can go through different setups and experiment. So get comfortable with lighting and make sure that it doesn't scare you if you're going on set and you don't know how to light something. Just know how light behaves. For the most part, when we're talking about these different tips, your main goal is to create some separation between your subjects and what you want your audience to pay attention to and your background. A lot of times that is done with ways like we talked about with downstage lighting, with creating separation via kickers like what I'm doing right now, which is edging me and the chair. I also have a little bit of a hair light up top so that I can also not blend in with the darker black tapestry that I have back there in that wall. So your main goal should be separation, and that is because when we are consuming media, whether it's a film in a movie theater or a video on your phone screen, it's always going to be through a flat medium. So you're looking at a 2D image, and it is your job as a filmmaker to communicate dimension to your viewer by using things like lighting. So that is why it's super crucial, but don't think that you have to always bring out kickers and rim lights and hair lights for every single one of your subjects. Sometimes you can also bring up the brightness value of your background to create some separation when it's compared to the brightness value of your subject. So you can have a moodier and darker subject and put that against a brighter background, and you have separation. But of course, all of that and the route that you choose to take really depends on your story and the themes in it. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. I tried putting in as much valuable information in this as possible. If you are enjoying these videos, give it a like. It really helps this video reach more people. And of course, it would also help a lot if you share this video with someone that is interested in lighting and that could use these tips. I just released a vintage light effects pack that I think will help you a lot in getting some of these results even in post, and playing with some light hits and coloring even your scene with these elements to really bring out certain details even once your shooting is all said and done. Follow me on Instagram because I'm going to be showing a little bit of behind the scenes on how I lit this setup. Speaking of lighting, I thought I would try something different, and I think I really like it. I think I'm gonna stick with this. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. My name is Chris for Kriscoart, and I will see you next time.